breakout? Is
It
this
was,
the class we're in now?
Yeah.
There's never enough time in these sessions, Brandon. We need to make these like 17 minutes instead of 7 minutes.
Yeah, we could certainly do that.
Maybe we should have one, once every quarter or something, just a random breakouts.
Yeah.
It's a whole series of 10 or 15-minute breakouts.
I love that idea, John. It would be like
a speed dating.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Got some
Cool. If we want to open it up, if we've got some new people on the line, raise your hand online, and Brandon will call on you. Give us a kind of a quick introduction of who you are and what brought you to the community.
Yeah, if you're new, use the Wendy, go for it to kick us off. But the rest of you, if you are new, you can use the Zoom raise your hand feature, and then I'll be able to call on you next.
Hello, everyone. Today's my first meeting. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm a partner principal in a consulting firm called Intune Collective. It's a traditional, boutique management consulting, but we also layer in human development. So how do we help businesses be human-centered in all that we do? And I'm happy to be here and meet everybody.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Go ahead and put your contact information in the chat room if you'd like. Anybody else new that would like to take the stage for a few seconds? Isaiah?
Hey, so yeah, I'm Isaiah Trotter, and the thing I do is I help CEOs of freelance marketplaces test and de-risk innovative products to prevent disruption. And the mission I'm on is to, kind of similar to your guys' mission, I want to dramatically improve 1 billion people's quality of life by 2052. And I'm focusing in freelancing to be able to make that impact. So glad to be here.
Welcome. Anybody else? Trying to look around at the screen. I think we're good, John Healy.
All right, good. So I think we've got a fun topic ahead today. Of if we say we're going to hit 1 billion people, there's one geography in the world in particular that already has 1 billion people in it, and is ready for some help. So we're going to kick off there. But before we dive into that, just a reference, and Brandon will throw some links in there. We've got a couple events coming up for people to be aware of. In the US, iWorker and IPSI have come together, and they have a policy event going on in DC next week. So it's the Progressive Policy Institute has come together. Free event for people. They're trying to get people to be physically in DC to go through things and explore this. I know Carl Camden, former CEO at Kelly, is one of the visible people leading that. They had kicked off policy event a couple years ago and seemed to have some good traction with both the left and the right side of the aisle in Congress right now. So we'll be interested in see what comes out of that. I'll give an update coming out of it because I'll be up in DC for it. And then we've got Freelancer Business Month coming up as well. And that'll be in October of this year, but the registration just opened up. A lot of people think of the organization as predominantly European-centric, but I would actually argue as you get to know them, they're very broad and very global in scope of what's there. Just happen to be a company who's headquartered in Europe. So I know that's going to be a virtual event that'll bring people in from all over. So with that, I'm going to kind of turn this over to Mark Hannant. I know last week, or I guess our last call, many of you got to hear from Bettina Schaller at ADECO and the World Employment Confederation. I know one of Mark's guests well because he is also tied to the World Board as well. So Mark, I'll turn the show over to you.
Thank you, John, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Greetings from Mumbai, where the monsoon is properly upon us, and I hope that I'm not going to get disturbed with rain coming in through my open window. India is set to become home to the world's largest workforce, overtaking China probably in about 5 years' time, around 2027. There are some significant differences between India and China in terms of the demographic. India's population is significantly younger. India is home to 440 million millennials. I coined the term Midnight's grandchildren to describe that cohort, that young generation who came of age after 1991 their life experience has been very different from that of the generations that came before them, born after independence in India, who grew up in an era of austerity and scarcity and lack of opportunity. That young generation has been born into an era of opportunity and abundance, and they've known rapid economic growth. And that's impacted, transformed, disrupted essentially all institutions, from the family through to the world of brands, but perhaps nowhere more so than in the workplace. Those earlier generations looked for security and a job for life, and were perhaps reasonably happy with sort of slow progress up the corporate hierarchy. And as we all know, those younger people coming into the workforce, probably anywhere in the world, but I think particularly in India, are markedly different. They are more mobile, they want quicker progress, they're after instant gratification, and of course they are digitally native. And so I think that that demographic, combined with the digital technology that enables young Indians new access into the workforce, is a very potent combination. And I'm delighted to have two guests who are knowledgeable experts on the subject. First of all, I'm going to introduce Dr. Sakshi Khurana. And some of you will have heard over the past month me make reference to a report and a policy paper that was published by NITI Aayog. NITI Aayog is the Indian government's think tank or strategy function. Sakshi, if you don't mind me calling you that rather than Dr. Khurana, we're very informal around here. Sakshi is the lead author of that report. And I'm first of all going to ask her to tell us a little bit about NITI Aayog, and just so that we get a sense of who has commissioned that piece of work, and then to talk about some of the policy initiatives. And then I'm going to call on Lohit, who has a couple of decades experience in workforce and as John said, member of the World Employment Confederation, who I think can speak from a sort of industry perspective. And so we've got two different perspectives on what I think is a very exciting part of the world, where there's some interesting innovation happening, which I think will be relevant to us. And it might be that there are things that we can potentially learn from India that have the opportunity or the potential to be applied elsewhere. You know, historically, the view has been that there are things that happen in the West that should come and be applied in places like India. I increasingly think that there are innovations and things that happen in these parts of the world that the rest of us could learn from. And so with that, Sakshi, can I hand over to you and invite you to perhaps, first of all, just tell us a bit about NITI Aayog, and then the genesis of the paper that you and your team authored.
So thank you, Mark, for inviting me. First of all, I'm also joined here by my colleague Ocean from NITI Aayog, who's also worked on the report. She's been a part of the team. And I'm glad to be joined by Mr. Lohit Bhatia on this for this discussion. To talk about NITI Aayog first, NITI Aayog is a think tank for the government of India. NITI stands for National Institution for Transformation of India. So we're an institute where we come up with ideas for reform, futuristic ideas. We come up with knowledge products, reports, studies, and we also engage with different stakeholders such as central government ministries. We engage with the federal states. We engage with the districts which are below the states, a lot of local regional governments also. We engage with the private sector. For this work, we have been engaging with platform companies. I work in the skill development, labor employment vertical, and our work focuses a lot on labor issues, employment issues, skill development issues, and we work closely with the ministries of labor and employment, Ministry of Skill, very often giving them inputs for policy reform, for initiatives, for their schemes, programs. So that's the kind of work we do. Can I go on to talk about the report, Mark?
Please do. And I think Brandon will have put in the chat a link to the policy paper. So yes, please do
Yes.
tell us what was
Also,
the genesis of?
the
Yeah.
report with me. So the report, the idea was to come up with a report that can highlight the potential of this sector. As Mark was, you very nicely put it, that India has a huge demographic dividend, youth population, which is aspirational, which has ambitions, and also the policy environment favored proliferation of platforms in the country, especially in the last 10 years, also in the post-COVID-19 period. We have a Digital India campaign. We have UPI, which is Unified Payment Interface System, which was launched in 2016. We have good access to smartphones, internet, and a youth population that has a lot of access to smartphones, to internet. So the attempt was in this report to highlight the potential that this sector has for the country, for employment generation. Also to look at it from the worker perspective, to give a balanced perspective in the report, to not just talk about business generation in the sector, but also from the workers' perspectives, what are the challenges that workers may face. So the first thing that we did was to come up with estimates of the sector, which has been a challenge for us in the country, that how many workers are engaged in the sector, because we did not have direct, clear data. So we had a team of experts, Dr. Shashi Kumar, SK Shashi Kumar from BV National Labour Institute, which is a reputed labor research institute. Also Professor Vinod Ibrahim from Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, Kerala, who did the estimates for this study. So we came up with estimates that reveal that almost 7.7 million workers are presently engaged in the sector in India. And we also present projections for 2030 in the report. And according to the projections, the workers are likely to be 23.5 million in 2030, which will make about 4.1% of the total workforce in 2030. So estimates is a major contribution of this report. We've also looked at the increase in the number of workers in different sectors, in retail, manufacturing, construction, across different sectors. We've also looked at, in terms of skill level, the report notes that 47% of the gig work is in medium skill jobs, 22% in high skill, and about 31% in low skill jobs. And our estimates reveal that in 2030, there's likely to be a bit of polarization of skills, with low skill category of workers are likely to increase to 33.8%. High skill workers are likely to increase to 27.5%. And medium skill workers might show a decline down to 38.7%. So estimates we felt are very important for giving directions for policy. At the same time, the report also highlights the role of platforms in women's employment generation, the role of platforms in offering opportunities to persons with disabilities. So as some of you might be aware, that women are disadvantaged in the labor market. In India, we have low, like for many other labor markets also. In India, we have a low female labor force participation rate, which has been as low as 18% to 24% now. So the report highlights the potential that the sector has for women. It documents studies that have mentioned that women acknowledge the employment generation potential of this sector. They're given their the normative social responsibilities of care work in the household that women are always challenging to take care of. gig and platform sector might offer them some flexibility. The report also highlights that for women, platforms also have a role in economic empowerment in enabling women to take up jobs in non-traditional sectors like driver partners, and some platforms like Uber and Ola in India have in fact enabled active onboarding of women for these platforms. So the report comes up with policy recommendations, suggestions for stakeholders for generating, enabling employment opportunities for all workers, especially for women, for persons with disabilities, on enhancing employability of the workforce, enabling a transition from the informal sector to formal sector for workers who are, for instance, engaged as street vendors selling food. And the report also documents initiatives, global best practices on social security across the world, so that we can draw lessons for India on how platforms can design social security measures, which are also in line with the Code on Social Security, which is a legislative measure introduced recently in 2020, and which recognizes gig and platform workers. I'll stop here, Mark, and we can.
Yeah, the point that you make there, I think, is very interesting. The one that gig workers have been recognized by the Indian government fairly recently. I have a question, which is one able to be both a sort of full-time employee and a gig worker? Because, you know, in lots of other parts of the world, the trend seems to be towards people having a full-time employment and then having the kind of side hustle, right? And they're going and spending some of their time on Upwork or Topcoder or whatever the Communo or whatever the platform is. In India, is that allowed? Do you have to be sort of categorized as one thing or the other, or is that opportunity for you to wear more than one hat?
So what we find is that, yes, workers are engaged in multiple jobs, which could be in the formal sector, informal sector, platform sector as well. And within the platform sector, workers engaged with different platforms. So that is something which we've documented in the report. But we also document the fact that for many workers, especially women, platforms are the main source of income. So of course, to augment their income, we find workers sometimes taking up multiple jobs. But for women, it might actually be the main source of income and the only source of income for them.
One of the other things that I was interested in is the fact that, you know, in India, a lot of the economic growth, a lot of the economic development is happening away from the major metros and away from even what might be described as tier 2 cities. Lots of places that are, you know, full of young people, hungry for opportunity and very aspirational. So I was interested in your view on the degree to which platforms and the gig economy sort of enable people who've been outside of the formal economy to be brought into it.
So we highlight the role that platforms play in enabling micro entrepreneurship. For instance, platforms enable, they give financial literacy or financial skills to workers. They enable, you know, using smartphones, using what I mentioned, UPI, which is a unified payment interface, so that they can do digital payments. So also we highlight that how platforms are enabling women to monetize their idle assets. For instance, a spare room in the house, or you know, if women have access to smartphones, they're as likely as men to, you know, access a lot of services through the smartphones. So how platforms enable creative entrepreneurship opportunities, that is something which we have highlighted. And in our recommendations, we also talk about how skill development can enable workers in the informal sector. Like I mentioned about people selling their you know, regional cuisine as street vendors, small stalls. And if they can be linked to platforms, so that's a chance for them to augment their earnings, to have better income, to have more formal, sort of employment. So that is something that we highlight, that what more can be done to enable the transition from informal to formal sector.
And that's a point at which I'd like to bring Lohit in. Welcome, Lohit. India has a massive informal sector. I don't know the data in terms of how many people or what proportion of the population or the working population is in that informal sector, but it feels to me like one of the opportunities here is to bring people who have historically been in the informal sector, probably outside of the sort of tax regime, undocumented largely, into more formal employment. And I wonder whether that's an area where you might like to sort of pick up the story.
So, good evening, everyone, and I hope everyone is safe wherever they are joining us today from. Thank you, John, and thank you, Mark, for having us here today. Dr. Sakshi, love the report and great explanation that you've already given to everyone. So let me just set a bit of a context before I come exactly to what Mark wants to know. India is 1.4 billion people. And I think John made that point, and a couple of others as well. We are going to surpass China very soon in the population metric itself. We are also going to surpass any other part of the world as far as the labor force is concerned. People above the age of 18, which is who can be officially gainfully employed, is 60% of the Indian population. So that gives you about 850 million people. Within that 850 million people, the unfortunate part in India is the labor force participation is extremely low. It's just 44, 45%. Rest of the world, developed world, an average would be about 55, 56% would be the labor force participation. And one of the key reasons for that is what Dr. Sakshi already mentioned, and I just wanted to put that point across, and then you'll understand why, is just 21% women come and work. And because of the missing women from the workforce, our labor force participation continues to remain rather low. Now, add another data point to that. The informal sector that Mark just wanted to know about is 83% in India. This is the second worst after Africa all over the world. And that tells you that only 17% of Indian population today has any form of a formal employment. And how do we define formal employment? Someone who has an appointment or an offer letter, someone who has social security coverage, someone who has a pension plan, someone who has skilling on the job and an ability to move forward and get appraised. Now that's just 17% of the population. So what really happened in this economy in about 75 years is we were a highly rural economy, agri-dependent economy. Most economies, as they start to develop and grow, they create adjacencies. People from rural typically go into goods and transportation. They would go into logistics. They would go into warehousing. They would eventually go into manufacturing. They would go into assembly lines. Then they would go into supply chain, from supply chain to trading, from trading to services. India actually leapfrogged. We went from agricultural and rural to a great extent into services. And what I mean by services is back in 91, we had a huge amount of liberalization and the economy started to open up. So in the last 3 decades, the benefit has been to the people who are educated. The benefit has been to people who are graduates, postgraduates, who are in a white collar job, who worked for the banking sector, who worked for the telecom sector, who worked for the IT industry. And that is where has carried the 17% of the formal workforce. So now what started to happen is that 83% of the population, which is in informal, is crying out loud to get included in the overall economy. And they want to be part of the entire social fabric itself, to get the same benefits that any other employee gets. So 2 forms of employment have started to become really large. If you go back, let's say, to my father's time, and my father was one of those children around the independence 75 years ago, slightly earlier than independence itself. They would know only one employer, and that employer used to be the government of India. Other than government of India, there used to be no jobs, and every job used to be only one job for 40 years. You work at a permanent place. By the time you come to our kind of people, most of the people had graduated from only a government job or a public sector job to the private sector job. And in the last 20 years, what started happening is the staffing industry has taken over. The temporary workforce has come there. So it's not just permanent jobs, but it's also temporary jobs. Jobs which would be permanent and they would be formal, but with one employer, they could be with a temporary period. The large population of India, the youth of India, and I believe Mark had in his opening comment itself also mentioned that the degree of digitization in India, Dr. Sakshi mentioned something called UPI. Now, that's just one acronym that she's given you, but practically what's happening is billions of transactions happen in India seamlessly from peer to peer, paying each other using a mobile phone. The amount of digital network that we have and the mobile footprint that we have, the smartphones that India has in hundreds of millions, has suddenly given an ability to this youth, which has always been kept out of the formal employment. And they have started coming to the platform companies and landing on for gig workers. So the way we look at employment today is a person from informal can come with all sorts of flexibilities that they need to a gig in a platform economy, from where people, as they transition, let's say they were to age, they were to get married, they were to have responsibilities of children, would graduate to a staffing or a temporary position, from where they become a supervisor or a manager and they graduate to a permanent position. So the entire supply chain of talent market starts to get fulfilled. Interestingly, in all of this, while half of the world is trying to fight the battles against the platforms and the gig companies, let's say the California case, the London case against Uber, and likewise, Indian government in 2020 already came out with a policy document saying, hey, we will recognize platform and gig worker, not as an employee-employer relationship, but as a form of employment which is available to the youth. And in the code, the social security code that Dr. Sakshi was mentioning, they've said for every platform economy company, they have to contribute 1 to 2% of their GMV or 5% of the payout to each of the gig workers on a monthly basis, so that they can be taken care of as far as pension is concerned, as far as disability insurance is concerned, as far as death insurance is concerned, and a settlement to the family can be done. So the point I'm trying to make is we've understood only one form of employment, which was permanent employment. Today, there are necessarily 4 forms of employment. You can be a trainee or an apprentice. You can definitely be a gig worker. You can be a temporary staffing worker through an agency, and you can definitely be a permanent employment. And interestingly in this, what you'll notice is that the fastest growth is happening in the gig and the platform economy, along with the temporary and the staffing economy as well. Monk?
That was excellent. Lohit, thank you very much. Those of you that come regularly know that this is a rarity because Balaji has been sat there quietly with his hand up. So for about 15 minutes. So Balaji, I'm going to invite you in, and I'm sure that you've got a good perspective on a question.
Yeah, and I think it is, while the numbers in terms of percentages or labor participation in India is low, but even that 17% dwarfs like continents together, right? And then again, I think there are one hypothesis at least that I have is what the platforms do is almost create a global rate card. So your ability to do 1 hour of work serving a client in the US is a lot more lucrative for the Indian worker than serving a local entity, which means that there is a very famous chart that freelancer.com has in their annual report, which shows almost like a light up chart of where the supply is coming out of. And India is the biggest place where all the lines go out of, right? And if you think about it, the reason that happens is because when you have really high education attainment levels and lower opportunity, people look for other places to make income. What I have not seen enough of is actually looking at that as an opportunity for income into India, and actually facilitating those conversations, enabling ease of payments, and actually pushing that as the new generation of the ITES sector, which the government supported and invested in the last 15, 20 years. This is a different way in which the same type of an ability to support other countries and other places with the huge population that we have what have you seen that is happening in enabling and facilitating almost like a market share where all of the work comes to India to get it done at an individual level versus an enterprise level?
I think that's a great point, Balaji. In fact, Dr. Sakshi briefly alluded to it when she said that for the women workforce, and I was also making the same point, that they are the missing workforce as far as our labor force participation is concerned. Today, what platform companies have started to do is that they've started to provide that flexibility to someone who's wanting to work from home, provide and render their skills by the hour for, let's say, content writing, let's say, speech recognition, let's say, analytics, any kind of a work which you can do by the hour, and you can do it from the comfort of your home, and you're an individual contributor. And many people who left work for whatever reason, maybe they're taking care of aged parents, and you know the situation in India, because you're looking at not just looking after the generation younger to you, you're also often looking after the generation older than you, with the joint family systems, and those things kick in. A lot of these people have started coming on these platforms, not just providing and rendering services to the Indian companies, but also to global companies. And that's the other wave of work which would be visible. So within Dr. Sakshi's report, if you really notice, she spoke about the skilled, highly skilled category, the medium skilled, and then the low skilled. It's the low skilled and the medium skilled which shows dramatically when it comes to volume. So that's the Ubers, the Olas, the Swiggies, and the Zomatos. But when you come to the skilled and the highly skilled, you'll also often find that a lot of people who've left the labor market are finding it a lot easier to come back using this route. So there will be more of this which will happen, provided we also have sustainability of work coming into those platforms, and that's starting to change by the hour or by the day. The second point, and importantly, and I just wanted to slip that point in before we go to somebody else, is, the beauty about a true gig platform or a gig work is where the gig provider gets the maximum bang for buck for every hour that the person renders on the platform. Whereas the person consuming the service, which is on the customer side, lands up actually getting a very economic resource. The point I'm trying to make is, if you need an Uber driver from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. in the morning, and that's your surge, Uber is happy to pay for that. Consumer is happy to pay for the surge, but they don't have to have that person for the whole 10 hours of the shift, because you don't have work for all 10 hours. At the same time, the driver can make the maximum buck for those 2 hours, but he can also hop on to Zomato or Swiggy and become a food delivery person for the next 2 hours, which could probably be the breakfast shift. And that was the point again, Dr. Sakshi was also trying to make, that people have been found to do multiple gigs and have been found to be on multiple platforms to maximize their earning, which necessarily does not mean that it's a higher cost for the employer or the person consuming the service.
Thank you.
Sakshi, did you want to add anything to that answer to Balaji's question about, sort of the individual opportunity versus the enterprise opportunity?
Thank you. That was a very good explanation from Mr. Lohit, Bhatia, and your question about individual and the platform. So one is that in the report, we've tried to highlight both the perspective of the worker and the platform, but also, like I said, how platforms enable better incomes or entrepreneurship for workers. And we talk about how platforms can take the initiative in many aspects, in offering credit, in offering insurance, like accident insurance or health insurance for workers. We also talk about a corpus fund that the platform company can have to support workers, to ensure income support, for instance. So we have tried to talk about both the worker and the platform perspective, and also emphasizing how workers from vulnerable social groups have the opportunity to have good incomes, to experience micro entrepreneurship through their association with the platform. Also, if I may address one of the questions in the chat on what the report says on vulnerable groups, suggestions, stakeholders on social inclusion. So we've talked about case studies where different platforms have actively engaged in onboarding workers from vulnerable social groups. And we've also come up with a good list of recommendations of what platforms can further do. They could have more people in the supervisory positions from the vulnerable groups. They could have sensitization campaigns. They could also have 24/7 helplines so that workers have more support, especially workers in vulnerable groups, workers who are minorities, workers who are women, persons with disabilities. Also, skilling for this group of workers who are more vulnerable, how platforms can lead and give special attention to skilling of these workers who are from the vulnerable section. So we've presented the idea of skill badges and skill passports, which can be displayed on the profile of the workers so that to enable horizontal and vertical mobility for the worker to have better incomes. People recognize that, okay, the worker has upgraded his or her skills. So those are the kind of suggestions we presented in the report.
I think accreditation and portability are two sort of topics that we keep coming back to on these calls. I see that there are questions in the chat. Vijay, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, absolutely, sure. So thanks a lot, Sakshi and Lohit. It's been an interesting discussion now. To introduce myself, I work for the Adecco Group. It's one of the biggest, staffing and HR services company in the world. My question is around, the regulatory reforms in India and tax reforms in India. What we're seeing in Europe is that the regulators, European Commission especially, is also clamping down on the platforms in terms of social protection and the safety net for gig workers. That actually is counterproductive to what you were saying, Lohit, earlier on. I mean, you're almost talking about a timeshare, multi-tenant usage of workforce on a platform. That's becoming a problem because they're with the regulatory reforms, especially in some countries like Spain, now in the Netherlands and Italy elsewhere, right? So the platform is requiring the worker to be considered as a full-time employee, or in the case of UK, as a worker, as in they have to process pension fund, etc. And on the tax side, tax authorities have been clamping down because some countries also have had some loopholes in the way they've been using the gig working sort of environment as a loophole for avoiding taxes, right? So that's causing a lot of reforms in the way the platforms are working. So my question to you both is, what's happening in India these days in terms of regulatory reforms, tax reforms around platforms? So what's your perspective on that?
So, Dr. Sakshi, if I may go first, then you can. So, Vijay, I think that's the point I was trying to make, that while Europe and UK in particular against the Uber drivers issue, the court case which happened in the California case which has happened and all, India has gone a step further and they have recognized that this is growing and growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, the only one thing which I do not agree with NITI Aayog and Dr. Sakshi's report is I think they've been conservative, and most government-related policy bodies are generally conservative. So when she says, the only thing I do not ascribe is, she says by 2030 will be 23 million. Our own estimated is that it will be definitely 50 million to 100 million people in gig. The point I'm trying to make is the Indian government clearly realized that when you try to ban something, it goes under the radar, goes below the carpet, and it becomes even more illegal, and it becomes difficult to administer. So what the government has done is, government has said, you have a choice to have a permanent employee, a temporary employee through an agency like yourself, the Adecco Group. You have a choice to have an apprentice, again through an agency or directly. And then you are also having gig and platform workers. Now, what do we want you to do with gig and platform workers? We first want you to acknowledge and accept and register them, that yes, you have gig and platform workers. Second, if you do have them, under the Social Security Code 2020, you will either pay 1 to 2% of your GMV, or you'll pay 5% of the payout to each of the workers every month into this fund, which will be managed by the government. And against that fund, the worker and the workers' families will get benefits. Now, which is just one quick conservative math will tell you that an average gig worker today, and Uber and Ola would tell you that it's much larger than that, they can earn about 15,000 Indian rupees, which is about $200 US a month today. At 15,000 rupees a month, if that 5% were to go to the government, that's about 750 rupees per month, and that's about $10 US a month per worker. And Dr. Sakshi's report, which I call conservative, by the way, is 23.3 million people, 5 million people. The day that happens, you're talking about a corpus of $3 billion coming into that fund, which can then fund Social Security. It can fund life and death and disability benefits. So I think what India has done, and which is where I was making that point of leapfrogging, instead of saying this is taboo, let's ban it. And when we ban it, we're going to create more permanent jobs or more temporary jobs, and hence let's ban gig. See, employers do not work like that. And Vijay, we all know. Permanent jobs, I mean, temporary staffing has been there for 70, 75 years the world over, right? But Lohit, it's not taken away from the permanent.
Lohit, I'm just going to sort of step in there and let Sakshi have a crack at that one, and then try and just get a couple more questions in before we close.
Yes, so as Ms. Lohit said, that most importantly, gig and platform workers have recognition in India through the code on Social Security. And there is a lot of talk in the policy circles on policies, especially around gig workers, which is to do with Social Security in particular. So the code on Social Security being a very important document that has a provision for a Social Security fund with tripartite contribution from platforms, from workers, from the government, which Mr. Lohit talked about. So it's certainly in the report, yes, our estimates might have been conservative, and we do give a disclaimer that yes, these are just indicative, but we try to encourage and urge the platforms to design creative and get strong Social Security policies, initiatives for workers, so as to strengthen the Social Security net for these workers, which we all know are caught in the middle of this entire debate on their worker and employee characterization. So irrespective of the worker, their worker or employee identity, it's very important, we've tried to emphasize in the report, that they be given Social Security benefits. So that is an important issue. That's an important issue for debate, and it's being stressed quite a lot, I would say, in India right now, Social Security for gig and platform workers.
Thank you. Isaiah, I saw that you had a question in the chat, which I think was about number of freelancers. If you'd like to sort of pose that question, and then I'm just going to ask Brandon, could you see if you could find one other question in the chat that you think is of interesting, and then we'll sort of draw things to a close. Isaiah, over to you.
Yeah, I was just curious. I've looked online to try to find how many freelancers there are in India, and I just haven't been able to find a clear answer. There's stuff on the US and Europe, and I was just curious if there was a number that you guys found for India.
So there have been several estimates our report, which is in discussion right now, estimates 7.7 million workers which form part of this sector at present. And our projections, our estimates say that they're likely to increase to 23.5 million workers by 2030.
Okay,
And as
thanks.
we've heard, Lohit thinks that that's a highly conservative estimate, and that the number could be up to 4 times as much. Brandon, have we got time for one more?
We do. San, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, quickly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the analysis. I think we're sort of covering it, but I was actually just sort of wondering, obviously, in the if you take a market like the US, even the terminology we use, we think about this as a disruptive force. We use terms like side hustle and things, and the systems and the incentives are in place to promote traditional employment still. I think maybe unique to best, healthcare is probably one of the biggest ones. I'm just curious what your thoughts are in terms of, is India trying to make a level playing field with its regulation? Is it taking a position of a traditional employment from an incentive point of view, from a systemic incentive point of view? Is it taking a position on it, traditional employment versus, more kind of human-centric, whether we want to call it gig or whatever, platform work?
I think the right way to look at it is that India is creating a level playing field. Actually, before the policy came into force, there was no level playing field. If you had a permanent employee or you had a staffing employee through an agency, you had to pay for minimum wage, you had to disclose how many employees you had to pay pension, PF, ESIC, all the social security, all the benefits. But if you had a gig and a platform worker, you could keep it under the radar. You didn't have to disclose. You didn't have to talk about how much you're paying them. And you definitely had to contribute nothing towards social security. So by putting this clause of 5% towards their social security, actually, in a way, it puts a bit of a level playing field. So it tells the employer that if you were only trying to game the system by not having to pay for compliances of having employees, now you can't game the system. The second important aspect here is, and I think we must understand that fact also, there's a lot of transition happening from rural India, which is not as educated as everybody on this call today. They're not all blessed to have gone through a graduation or post-graduation or whatever. Many of them got disrupted in their education at very, very young age. And because of that, they need the first few stepping stones. And gig and platforms provide the first few stepping stones before which they can start graduating to the next level. So in many ways, it's a level playing field. But just to add one facet, and I see there's a question related to that as well. See, think of it from an employer's perspective for a moment. An employer is very clear. Just because you today allow them a gig and a freelance worker doesn't mean tomorrow every permanent job is gone away and everybody becomes a gig worker within the employer. If you have a strategic employment, then you'll always have a permanent employee. If you have a transactional employment, but that same transaction has to happen day in and day out, like a salesperson, you may have an agency worker or a temporary worker. But if you have a very transactional employee, and it doesn't matter who has come and done the transaction, it's just a pick and place operation or it's just a driving operation, then you much rather have a gig workforce and then you have a bigger workforce. So employers are going to be very clear as to why they are employing a human, and accordingly they'll plot in the different categories. It does not take away from one to another. That's our belief in it.
Thank you, Lohit. Sakshi, we're just about to come to the end of time. Any last comments that you would like to offer?
So to the last question, just to add to what Mr. Lohit said, that yes, India is providing a level playing field, but there's also a recognition of the fact that these workers do not necessarily form a part of a traditional employer-employee relationship. So the social security, traditionally, the social security framework that has existed in India is about employees' provident fund which workers subscribe to and employers subscribe to, and there is a monthly contribution. So for gig and platform workers, the legislative and policy framework tries to break away from this traditional framework, and it talks about the Social Security Fund, which Mr. Lohit mentioned about, allowing for a creative way of coming up with Social Security funding for gig and platform workers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sakshi. And we've kind of run out of time, so I'll hand back to you, Brandon, or John, sorry, to sort of sign off.
So Mark, thank you so much for coordinating this and for facilitating, Dr. Sakshi and Lohit. Thank you for your thoughts and your insights and perspectives on a market that's so important in so many different ways to this marketplace. Just a reminder for everyone that we're always anxious to help amplify your voice. If there's research that you're producing or that one of your partners is producing, if there's a story to be told that speaks to the value of the open talent community inside your organization, let us know. Let's make sure it's part of the conversation. Let Brandon and I know, and we'll make sure you get an opportunity to share that on an upcoming call. Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys. All the best.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you all.
All
Thank
the
you.
best.
Thank you.